Texas Hill Country, spring of 1881. The April wind carried the scent of mesquite and dust, and Marshal Zane's revolver was still warm from the morning's target practice. But it was not bullets or outlaws that weighed on his mind, it was what to feed his daughter for supper. Marshal Zane had not planned on becoming a father alone. His wife died birthing little Rosalie just over 7 years ago, and since then he had raised her with his own 2 hands, calloused and clumsy though they were. He was 28 now, quiet, sturdy, with a jaw squared by grief and duty, and eyes the color of storm clouds before a downpour. He worked cattle, mended fences, and kept their sloping ranch house upright on the outer ridge of Blanco County, just the 2 of them, and a milk cow named Clover. "Papa, Clover stepped on my boot again," Rosalie said, running up the porch steps with a braid half undone and dust on her cheeks. "That cow has no manners," Marshal said, crouching to brush her off. "We'll have to teach her some." Rosalie giggled and leaned into his chest without thinking. He held her for a moment, arms strong around her back, but his heart ached. She needed more than he could give, more than patched dresses and bedtime stories about wild horses and stars. She needed a mother. So, 3 weeks ago, he'd written to a mail-order bride agency in Kansas City. He had not told Rosalie yet, not until he was sure. Her name was Josephine Alder, 23, no family left. She'd been raising 2 children, not her own, abandoned by her older sister in Missouri, and when the boy died of fever last winter, her heart broke clean through. She wrote with grace, but not polish. Her penmanship was plain. Her words were not. "I am not pretty," she wrote, "but I am kind. I can cook. I sing when I brush hair. I have not had much love in my life, but I have plenty of it to give. If your little girl needs a mother as much as I need a place to belong, then perhaps the Lord is opening a door." Marshal had read that letter over and over, under lamplight and beside the fire. He had not told anyone, not even Rosalie. But Josephine was coming. Today, he tied his best horse to the wagon and brought Rosalie into town, the wheels rattling over the limestone road. The stagecoach from San Antonio rolled in at noon, as expected, its black paint dulled by dust and heat. Marshal stood near the bank, Rosalie holding his hand, her blue eyes squinting against the sun. The woman who stepped down wore a gray dress that had been mended too many times, a plain satchel hugged to her chest. She had brown hair tucked into a neat bun and a tired grace about her, like someone who had known hunger, but never let it harden her. Their eyes met. She recognized him from his letter. He had sent a photograph, though he hated posing for it. Her lips parted. He tipped his hat. "Miss Alder," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes." Rosalie peeked around his leg. Josephine crouched down, her skirts folding like water. "You must be Rosalie," she said, offering her hand. Rosalie looked uncertain. Josephine smiled. "It is all right. I am a little scared too." Marshal started to speak, but Rosalie stepped forward and took her hand. Josephine blinked quickly and stood, her eyes shining. "Thank you for coming," Marshal said. She looked at him, really looked, and said, "Thank you for asking." They rode home through the soft hills, Josephine sitting beside Rosalie in the wagon seat, showing her how to braid grass and laughing when Rosalie made a crown out of it. Marshal watched them from the corner of his eye, his chest tight with something that was not fear or grief, but hope. At the ranch, Josephine unpacked slowly. She set her satchel on the small bed in the room that used to be a sewing room, now cleaned and ready for her. That night, she made stew with leftover beans and wild onions, humming under her breath. Rosalie leaned against her side as they stirred the pot together. After supper, Rosalie brought out her comb and handed it to Josephine without a word. Josephine sat on the porch swing, and the little girl climbed into her lap. Marshal stood in the doorway, watching, his hands folded uselessly. Josephine combed gently, slow and patient. "Your hair is just like your papa's, soft and stubborn." Rosalie turned to look up at her. "Will you stay?" Josephine's breath caught. She looked at Marshal, then back at Rosalie. "If you want me to." Rosalie nodded, then rested her head against Josephine's chest. Josephine held her tight. From the doorway, Marshal's eyes met Josephine's. For a long moment, nothing passed between them but silence and the sound of the wind through the live oaks. But it was enough. That night, After Rosalie was tucked in with her new braid and Josephine's lullaby still clinging to the air, Marshal knocked on the frame of her room's open door. She was folding a shawl. "She is a good child." "She is," he said, voice low. "She took to you fast." Josephine looked down at the shawl. "I took to her fast, too." He hesitated, then stepped inside. "You all right here?" "It is not much." She met his eyes. "It is more than I ever had." He nodded once, slow. "I meant what I wrote. I am not looking for a hired woman. I want a partner. Someone to raise her with me. Someone who will stay. I do not leave people," she said quietly. "But I have been left." He stepped closer. "Not here." She watched him, her throat moving as she swallowed. "Do you think we could be a real family?" Marshal reached out and gently touched her hand. "I think we already are." Josephine did not cry, but her eyes brimmed with something warmer. She held his hand in return, her fingers lacing between his. And that was the first night she fell asleep with a feeling she had not known in years belonging. Out under the Texas moon, with a child dreaming in the next room and a man with storm cloud eyes watching over them both, Josephine Alder had begun to believe in love again. The rooster crowed late, just as the sun broke across the ridge and turned the cedar tops gold. Josephine had been awake long before that, sitting at the edge of her cot with her shawl over her shoulders and her hands folded in her lap. The fabric still smelled faintly of rose soap, though the bars she'd brought from Missouri were nearly gone. Mornings had always been busiest in every house she'd stayed in, but this one was different, quiet, steady, expectant. From the open kitchen door, the clatter of kindling and the low hiss of the stove reached her. She stepped out into the hallway, bare feet brushing the cool wood, and found Marshal at the hearth, coaxing flame to life with a practiced hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled, and his hair still wet from the pump. "I was about to wake you," he said, not turning. "I heard the fire crack," she said softly. "Didn't want to waste the warmth." He nodded once and moved aside. "Coffee's on. If you take it." She crossed the floor and reached for the tin cup beside the stove. "I do." "Black." He handed her the first pour without looking at her hands, though she noticed his fingers paused a moment longer on the rim than necessary. She took it to the table and sat facing the window, where the first light touched the slope of the pasture. "What's her schooling like?" she asked. Marshal poured his own and leaned against the counter. "I taught her letters. Numbers. She reads some, writes slow. There's a schoolhouse near Comel Creek, but I never sent her. Too far." He shook his head. "Too many questions." "About her." "About me." He sipped, then added, "Folks mean well, but it's not always kindness that fills their mouths." Josephine nodded slowly. "Then I'll teach her here." He studied her face, but said nothing. She smiled faintly. "You already gave me a place to sleep. Might as well earn my keep." Later, while Rosalie still dreamt beneath her quilt, Josephine stepped outside with a wash basin tucked under one arm and a bar of lye soap in the other. The morning was damp, the grass cool beneath her boots. Chickens pecked near the coop, and the faint bray of a neighbor's mule echoed across the hills. She found the pump near the barn and set to scrubbing out linens that smelled of smoke and long use. Her wrists ached before the first rinse, but she welcomed the ache. It was honest work. Familiar. Marshal came around from the far fence line, leading a bay gelding with a limp in its back leg. "Stepped wrong crossing the creek," he said. "Needs rest." She glanced up from the suds. "Does he let you touch the leg?" "He trusts me, but he don't favor it." "Let me try something later," she said. "I've seen worse heal if they're wrapped right." His eyebrows lifted, not with doubt, but something like quiet surprise. "You know horses?" "I know pain," she said simply. "In animals and people both." He didn't speak again, but waited while she wrung the water from the linen and hung it over the line. She moved slow, careful, like she'd done it 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. That afternoon, Rosalie brought her a bouquet of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, clutched so tightly the stems were crushed. "They're for your room," she said. "So it smells like outside." Josephine knelt. "They're beautiful. I picked them myself. Papa says not to pull them from the roots, so I didn't." "You listen well." Rosalie grinned. "Sometimes." Josephine cupped the girl's cheek. "I'll put them in a jar by the window, so I can smell the outside even when I'm in." Rosalie's grin faded into something gentler. "Do you miss Missouri?" Josephine hesitated. "Not really." But I miss the children I raised there. Were they yours? No, but I love them like they were. Rosalie looked down at the bouquet. Do you think you could love me? Josephine's breath caught. She placed both hands over Rosalie's. I already do. Marshal stood in the doorway behind them, silent. He hadn't meant to overhear, but he didn't move. He watched as Josephine pressed a kiss to Rosalie's forehead and wrapped her arms around her without needing permission. That evening, Josephine stood at the stove again, this time with bread baking slow in the cast iron. The scent rose warm and yeasty, the crust turning golden. Rosalie set the table with care, placing the spoons perfectly parallel. After supper, they didn't speak much. The wind had come up, rattling the windows and shaking the shutters. Marshal lit a lamp and pulled a quilt over Rosalie's lap, where she sat in the rocker. Josephine sat beside her and began threading a needle. She worked slowly, patching the frayed hem of one of the girls' dresses, her fingers steady in the soft light. Marshal watched them from the far side of the room, his book forgotten in his lap. Your hands are sure, he said quietly. She didn't look up. I've had to mend more than clothes. He nodded, slow. I see that. When Rosalie fell asleep in the rocker, Josephine lifted her gently and carried her to bed. She returned after a long while to find Marshal still seated, the lamp turned low. He looked up, eyes tired but soft. You made her feel safe. She made it easy. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't say things lightly, but I want you to know I've never seen her smile that way. Josephine sat across from him. Close enough the firelight brushed her cheek. Then we'll keep giving her reasons to. They sat in silence, the fire crackling low between them. Outside, the wind settled, and with it, something inside each of them did too, not finished, not yet, but beginning to rest in the shape their lives might take together. And neither one reached for the moment too quickly. They let it settle gently, like dust after hooves, soft and sure. The rain came in slow that night, tapping against the windows like a memory trying to get in. Josephine lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the soft groan of the wind through the cedar posts. The room no longer felt foreign. She'd tucked her things neatly on the shelf, hung her shawl behind the door. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Across the hall, a floorboard creaked. She rose without lighting the lamp and crossed to the doorway, her bare feet silent on the boards. Marshal stood at the hearth, shirt half buttoned, the glow of the dying fire caught in his hair. He didn't turn when she stepped into the room. Couldn't rest? She asked, voice low. He shook his head once. Storms keep me up. Always have. Josephine crossed to the rocker Rosalie usually claimed and wrapped her arms around her knees. My sister used to sing when it rained. Said it was the only time nobody could hear her cry. Marshal looked over, brow furrowed. She gone? Josephine nodded. She left before winter 2 years ago. Didn't say where. Just took her boots and vanished. He sat on the edge of the table bench. Left you with the children? I try to make it feel like a home for them. But it's hard to build something when someone else keeps walking off with a hammer. Marshal let the quiet settle before speaking again. You ever think about leaving? After they were gone. Josephine studied the fire. Every morning. I'd open the door, stand on the porch, and think, I could just keep walking. But I always came back in. There was still bread to bake. Still dishes to scrub. I reckon staying was the only thing I had left to give. He watched her, that same still way he always did, like words meant more when they weren't rushed. You don't have to stay here out of habit, he said. Not if it starts to feel like another place you're just passing through. It doesn't. He nodded once, almost to himself. All right. The next day dawned with the sky hung low and heavy. The ground was too wet for field work, so Josephine gathered scraps and began piecing a quilt near the window while Rosalie practiced her reading aloud. Marshal took to the barn to check on the gelding, who was still favoring the leg but bearing weight better. By mid-morning, Rosalie wandered near the fire and tugged at Josephine's sleeve. Can we make a pie? Josephine looked over the girl's head toward the pantry. We don't have much left for filling. We've got molasses, Rosalie offered. Josephine smiled. That we do. They worked side by side at the counter, Rosalie rolling dough with a bottle wrapped in cloth, Josephine measuring molasses into the tin. The scent of ginger and sweet syrup filled the room in a way that felt like more than hunger. When Marshal stepped inside, dripping from the barn, he paused in the doorway. That smells like something worth coming home to, he said, voice warm. Rosalie beamed. We made it together. Josephine turned, wiping her hands on her apron. It'll be ready after supper. If you can keep your fingers out of it until then. I make no promises. Later, after the pie cooled and the dishes were rinsed in rainwater, Josephine stepped outside to air her hands. The clouds had cleared enough to show strips of blue between them, and the scent of damp earth hung thick in the air. Marshal joined her after a while, arms folded loosely, his boots still muddy. You didn't have to come out. Didn't want you out here alone. She looked over, her face unreadable in the fading light. You always this careful with people? Only the ones I can't afford to lose. Josephine's breath caught, but she didn't look away. You think I'm one of those? I do. They stood in silence, the kind that didn't ask for filling. Behind them, the soft clatter of Rosalie sorting her books drifted through the open door. Marshal shifted his weight, voice lower now. I've been thinking about the way she looks at you. Like she's waiting for you to disappear. Josephine nodded, her voice small. She doesn't know how to trust it yet. He looked toward the hills, then back at her. Maybe none of us do, but I want her to learn it here. With us. Josephine stepped closer, eyes searching his. And you? I want it too. She reached out slowly, giving him time to step back. He didn't. Their hands met, fingers folding together with quiet certainty. I'm not afraid of staying, she said. I'm not afraid of giving you a reason to. His hand tightened slightly around hers, and that was all it took. When they stepped inside together, Rosalie looked up from the hearth. Did you see the stars? Josephine smiled. Not yet. Rosalie stood and reached for her hand. Come look. So they did. All three of them, standing just beyond the porch rail, the night full of damp cedar and the hush of crickets. Josephine stood between them, the little girl's hand in one of hers, the man's in the other. And the stars came out, slowly, like they'd been waiting for this moment to appear. The wind shifted with the season, carrying the dry scent of sun-warmed stone and the pale green flush of new mesquite. Days lengthened, and the hills wore a softer color. Josephine stood outside the chicken coop, sleeves rolled and apron dotted with feed dust, her eyes on the far rise where Marshal's silhouette moved slow along the fence line. He'd been replacing a post that morning, and she could tell by the slope of his shoulders he'd hit a patch of rock again. She turned back to the coop just as Rosalie darted around the corner with a ribbon clenched in one hand. Can I tie it on Clover's tail? Josephine wiped her palms on her apron. Only if you don't mind her sitting on it. Rosalie paused, expression thoughtful. She does like to sit. Then maybe your hair would be safer. Rosalie nodded solemnly and handed it over. You tie it. You make the bow better. Josephine knelt, hands gentle. Hold still, bird. I'm not a bird. You flit like one. Rosalie giggled, but she didn't move. When the bow was set, Josephine stood and brushed straw from her skirt. Rosalie ran off toward the oak by the creek, her boots kicking up dust. Josephine's gaze followed her, then drifted back to the barn where Marshal had just stepped into the shade. She crossed the yard, stepping around a patch of wild onions, and found him leaning against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief. You'll ruin your back on that post, she said. He lifted his head, giving her a look that held more weariness than pride. Stones set deeper than I thought. Let me see. He stepped aside, and she crouched beside the hole where the broken post still leaned. The soil was clay thick, clinging to the splinters. If you soak it overnight, it'll give by morning. You sure? My uncle farmed in Creek Bottom. He swore by it. She stood and dusted her hands. We can draw water from the well after sundown. Let the sun do its work first. Marshal nodded slowly. You always this certain? She shrugged. Only when I've been wrong enough times to learn. He studied her face for a long moment. You ever think of planting here? Josephine tilted her head. You mean a crop? He nodded. Half-acre behind the barn's been clear since my father passed. I never had time to tend it. I could grow beans, maybe squash. If we can keep the deer out. Would you want to? She looked toward the house, where the roofline caught the late sun. Yes. That evening, after Rosalie fell asleep with her knees still smudged from the creek bank, Josephine stepped outside with an empty bucket. She expected to find the yard quiet, but Marshal was already at the well, lowering the rope hand over hand. I couldn't sleep, he said when she reached him. Neither could I. He drew the bucket up slow, the pulley creaking. The water sloshed as he set it down. Josephine knelt beside it and dipped her hands in. The chill bit her skin, pulled a breath from her chest. I used to think if I could just get somewhere quiet, I'd be all right. And now, she didn't look up. Now I think quiet's only peace if someone's listening. Marshal crouched beside her. I hear you. She met his eyes. Do you? I do. They carried the bucket out to the fence line in silence. She poured it over the stubborn earth, the water darkening the clay in slow, spreading circles. When it was done, she handed him the bucket. We'll try again tomorrow, she said. He nodded. Together. Inside, the lamp still burned low in the kitchen. Josephine moved to snuff it, but paused. The house smelled of flour and wood smoke, and something else, something warmer. She turned when Marshal stepped behind her. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. I've lived quiet for a long time. Kept to myself, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know how to ask for more. I know that feeling, she said. I want you to have more than a room in my house. I want it to be yours, too. Josephine's lips parted, but no sound came. I know it's early, he said, voice lower now. I know we're still learning each other. But I see how she looks at you, and how you look at her. And I want to give her a home where love's not borrowed or waiting to be taken back. Josephine stepped closer, the hem of her dress brushing his boots. I didn't come here expecting to be wanted. I came because I was tired of being forgotten. But when she took my hand, when you did, she swallowed. I stopped feeling like a guest. Marshal reached for her hand. Then stay as more. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, the word quiet but sure. He bent his head, and she lifted hers. And there in the hush of the kitchen, beneath the soft flicker of lamplight, their lips met for the first time, unhurried, steady, and real. When they parted, Josephine rested her forehead against his chest. You're warm, she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her. So are you. Outside, the wind passed through the oaks, and the earth drank deep from the water they'd poured. Behind them, Rosalie stirred once in her sleep, then settled again, tucked beneath the roof of a home no longer held together by grief alone, but by something far stronger growing steady in the quiet. The morning sun rose slow behind the ridge, casting long blue shadows over the eastern fields. Josephine stood at the back edge of the cleared patch, a seed bag slung over one shoulder. The ground was still soft from the recent rain, the kind of soil that held promise if given care. She didn't call for help. She wanted the work in her hands, the rhythm of it. Her apron was tied high, and her boots sank slightly with each step as she sowed beans in a neat line, pressing the earth close behind her with the heel of her palm. From the barn, Marshal watched her a moment before crossing the yard, wiping his hands on a cloth. You've got a good eye for spacing, he said. Josephine glanced over her shoulder. I learned fast. Poor spacing meant poor meals. He stepped beside her, crouching to run his fingers through the soil. You're planting early. We're warm early. I'd rather take the risk than wait and lose the light. He stood slowly, brushing his hands off. You always work ahead of the season like that. Only since I figured out the world doesn't wait for me to catch up. Marshal nodded, then looked toward the house. You think Rosalie might like her own corner to tend? Josephine's lips tugged into something quiet. She would. She's got patience for growing things. Must have learned it from you. She's taught me more than I've given her, Josephine said. She's got a mind like a gate left open. Everything finds its way in. They walked back together, the silence easy between them. When they reached the porch, Rosalie was sitting cross-legged with the slate in her lap, her tongue tucked in concentration. She looked up when Josephine stepped close. I drew the creek, she said, holding it up, and the tree where the owl lives. Josephine crouched beside her. You remembered the bend in the roots. I want you to see it when he comes back. Marshal leaned against the post. The owl. Rosalie nodded. He only comes when it gets hot again. I've never seen him, Josephine said. I'll show you. He's not scared of me. Later that afternoon, after the mending was done and the stew set to simmer, Josephine found an old sheet tucked at the back of the cupboard. She took it outside, cut it into strips, and began wrapping the gelding's leg where the muscles still twitched with every shift. Marshal leaned on the stall door, watching as she worked. You've got a steady hand. Animals don't lie, she said. They don't pretend the pain's gone when it isn't. He stepped inside, close enough for her to feel the warmth off his shoulder. Neither do you. She tied the last strip and straightened slowly. I did once. For years. He didn't speak. I told myself I was all right, that I didn't need more than a roof and something to fill the pot. But I was wrong. Marshal reached out and let his hand rest lightly against her back, just above her waist. You're not alone in that. She turned to face him, the barn quiet but for the shifting of hooves and the wind through the slats. I keep waiting for something to fall apart, for this to turn into something I have to leave. It won't, he said. Not here. Josephine stepped forward, her heartbeat steady now. Then I want to stay with both feet planted. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing beneath her eye like he was memorizing her. I want that too. For good. They married in late May, beneath the oak near the creek. Rosalie carried a bundle of prairie flowers and stood between them, her hand in each of theirs. The preacher from Blanco came down with his wife and a hymn book, and the neighbors brought preserves and bread and a length of ribbon someone tied around the barn door. Josephine wore a dress she'd let down at the hem and stitched extra wide at the waist. She didn't care that it wasn't white. It was hers. Marshal wore his cleanest shirt and a look that hadn't touched his face in years, something open, something sure. When he said the vows, he looked her straight in the eye, voice low but steady. I will walk beside you, not ahead. I will make room for your voice and your heart. I'll keep the gate open. Josephine's hands didn't shake when she answered. I will build a home with you, not just a house. I'll carry the weight with you, even when it's heavy. I'll stay. They kissed beneath the branches, with Rosalie's arms wrapped around both their waists, and the sound of cicadas starting up in the grass. That summer, the garden came in strong. Rosalie's patch grew crooked but full. The gelding's limp faded. The kitchen smelled of sun-dried tomatoes and the kind of bread that rose slow and stubborn. Josephine taught Rosalie to stitch buttonholes and to hum while she worked. Marshal built a swing from a thick old rope and hung it from the tree by the creek. The owl returned in late August. Josephine saw him first, perched just above the bend in the roots. When she pointed him out, Rosalie whispered. He remembered. Marshal wrapped an arm around each of them and pulled them close. The house stayed warm through the winter. They read by the fire and played cards on stormy nights. Josephine sang while she mended, and Marshal sometimes joined, his voice rough and low beside hers. Rosalie made up new verses. They didn't speak of the years before. They didn't need to. They'd built something from what was left behind, and it held. By the following spring, Josephine's belly had begun to swell, and Rosalie took to resting her head there in the evenings, listening for what she called the quiet thump of another heart joining theirs. Josephine would stroke her hair and say, "You were the first piece of this family." Rosalie always answered, "But not the last." And she was right. That land saw births and seasons, dust and bloom. But what it held best was the life they built together, not loud, not easy, but rooted, full. And they never went hungry for love again.